Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me today. I have kind of a fun show for today. I'm going to be exposing a couple lies. They're actually pretty funny lies. Uh, to give you an example of how the his story was written. So I'm going to be talking at first about Pancho Villa. I think the word villa maybe came from his name, but I'm not really sure yet. And then I have some other interesting things that we once believed as the truth that I found kind of funny. So I thought, well, let's pull up a chair and let's have a few laughs today. Pancho Villa was a top military leader of the Mexican Revolution, whose exploits were regularly filmed by a Hollywood company. Yes, you heard me right. Pancho Villa, a Mexican leader of the revolution. His exploits were filmed by a Hollywood company. Wonder why that happened. Huh. Old Pancho Villa doesn't seem like he is who he really is, right? Who was Pancho Villa? Pancho Villa started off as a bandit who was later inspired by reformer Francisco Madero, helping him to win the Mexican Revolution. After a coup by Victoriano Huerta, Villa formed his own army to oppose the dictator, with more battles to follow as Mexican leadership remained in a state of flux. Pancho Villa was assassinated on July 20th, 1923, in Parral, Mexico. Pancho Villa was a Mexican revolutionary. This is what they get when and he spent much of his youth helping out on his parents' farm. After his father's death, when Villa was only 15 years old, he became head of the household. With his new role as protector of his household, he shot a man who was harassing one of his sisters in 1894. He fled, spending 6 years on the run in the mountains. While there, he joined a group of fugitives and became a bandit. Although the specifics of what occurred in Villa's life during this time are unknown, it's confirmed that he changed his name while on the run to avoid getting caught by the authorities. In the late 1890s, he worked as a miner in Chihuahua, in addition to selling stolen cattle. But it wasn't long before he added more serious crimes to his record, robbing banks and taking from the wealthy. In 1910, while still living as a fugitive, Pancho Villa joined Francisco Madero's successful uprising against Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz. With Villa's skills at reading, writing, fighting, and his knowledge of the land, Madero was named a revolutionary leader, and his company won the first battle of Ciudad Juarez in 1911. The rebels eventually drove Diaz out of power, and Madero took over the position of president, having named Villa a colonel. But it wasn't really smooth sailing under the authority of the new government, as Madero's position was challenged by another rebellion, this time led by Pascual Orozco, a revolutionary who worked with Madero and felt scorned by his position under Madero's regime. In 1912, General Victorio Huerta and Villa sought to protect Madero's newfound authority. But after Huerta accused Villa of stealing his horse, Villa's execution was ordered. Although Madero was able to grant Villa a reprieve shortly before his execution, he was still required to serve time in prison in June 1912. So Pablo Villa had quite a history, right? Being a man of the people, right? How often do we hear this? Pablo Villa is going to help the working class. Pancho Villa, born 1878. San Juan del Rio, Durango, Mexico, male. Well, that's questionable. Pancho Villa looks more like a woman to me. Best known for, Pancho Villa was a top military leader of the Mexican Revolution whose exploits were regularly filmed by a Hollywood company. Excuse me. So, why would they be filming him? Well, that's a good question, right? I found two articles, I think. Pancho Villa. So, the first casualty of war is truth, they say, and nowhere was that more true than in Mexico during the revolutionary period between 1910 and 1920. In all the blood and chaos that followed the overthrow of Porfirio Diaz, who had been dictator of Mexico since 1876, what was left of the central government in Mexico City found itself fighting several contending rebel forces, most notably the Liberation Army of the South, commanded by Emilio Zapata, and the Chihuahuan-based Division del Norte, led by even more celebrated bandit rebel Pancho Villa. And the three-cornered civil war that followed was notable for its unrelenting savagery, its unending confusion, and its unusual film deals. Specifically, it is remembered for the contract Pancho Villa was supposed to have signed with a leading American newsreel company in January of 1914. Under the terms of this agreement, it is said that rebels undertook to fight the revolution for the benefit of the movie cameras in exchange for a large advance payable in gold. So in 1914, they made an agreement with a newsreel company, okay? And what they get for that? Well, they got cash and gold. Even at this early date, there was nothing especially surprising about Pancho Villa or anyone else inking a deal that allowed cameras access to the areas that they controlled. Newsreels were a coming force. Cinema was growing rapidly in popularity. Attendance at Nickelodeons had doubled since 1908, and an estimated 49 million tickets were sold each week in the United States by 1914. Those customers expected to see some obvious advantage in controlling the way in which the newsreel men chose to portray the revolution, particularly for Villa, whose main bases were close to the U.S. border. Now, wasn't that convenient? What made Villa's contract so odd, though, was its terms, or at least the terms it was said to have contained. Here is how it is described. In 1914, a Hollywood motion picture company signed a contract with Mexican revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, in which he agreed to fight his revolution according to the studio's scenario in return for $25,000. The Hollywood crew went down to Mexico and joined Villa's guerrilla force. The director told Pancho Villa where and how to fight his battles. The cameraman, since he could only shoot in daylight, made Pancho Villa start fighting every day at 9 a.m. and stop at 4 p.m., sometimes forcing Villa to cease his real warring until the cameras could be moved to a new angle. It sounds outlandish, not to say impractical. But the story quickly became common currency, and indeed, the tale of Pancho Villa's brief Hollywood career has been turned into a movie of its own. Accounts sometimes include elaborations. It is said that Villa agreed that no other film company would be permitted to send representatives to the battlefield, and that if the cameraman did not secure the shots he needed, the Division del Norte would reenact its battles later. And while the ones that were, and while the And while the idea that there was a strict ban on fighting outside daylight hours is always mentioned in these secondary accounts, that prohibition is sometimes extended. In another semi-fictional reimagining recounted by Leslie Bethel, Villa tells Raul, the early Hollywood director, "Don't worry, Don Raul. If you say the light at 4 in the morning is not right for your little machine, well, no problem. The executions will take place at 6,
brought to you by Captivating History. The Mexican Revolution commonly refers to around 10 years, from 1910 to 1920, in which Mexico transitioned from Porfirio Diaz's corrupt dictatorship to a constitutional republic. The revolution that took place was both political and social. It involved the complex interplay of several factional groups. It was extremely violent and bloody, and is the source of many themes around what it means to be Mexican today, especially considering the idolization of revolutionaries such as Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. As with any study of a revolution, it pays to examine the causes, concerns, and events that were catalysts for change. There is often a correlation between the causes and the shape and nature of the revolution itself. The dictatorship of Diaz, though officially operating within a constitution, effectively ruled in an autocratic manner. He was re-elected to the presidency 7 times, though again, these were mostly unchallenged, uncontested victories. A former military general, Diaz is emblematic of the classic strongman in Latin American politics. He secured loyalty by dividing and conquering Mexico's different factions, offering incentives to those who would follow him, and ruthlessly eradicating any opposition that surfaced. His authority was based on the platform that he was improving the economy. He was a friend to Mexico's middle classes, who gained considerable wealth during his time in office. He facilitated wealthy landowners and foreign investors to buy up Mexico's land, take communal spaces from the poor and indigenous peasantry, and force these villagers to farm cash crops. Foreign investors were invited to snap up deals for Mexico's land rights for oil fields and mines. So much so that by the start of the revolution, around a quarter of Mexico's land was in the hands of foreign investors. A convergence of crises brought about the downfall of Diaz. First, a series of economic issues bred resentment in rural areas. The price of corn doubled at the beginning of the 20th century, causing terrible hardship among the agrarian classes. Droughts worsened circumstances. There was a growing awareness that Diaz's authority, based on an economic prosperity, benefited a select few and seemed to fail more generally as American companies began to be wary of their investments. Oppositional elements were also growing impatient with Diaz's heavy-handed oppressive political tactics. In 1908, Diaz spoke in an interview of a return to democracy, yet turned his back on the comments as he sought re-election in 1910. This prompted Francisco Madero, one of Mexico's richest men, to denounce the regime and found the anti-re-electionist party. Diaz imprisoned Madero, and though general outcry led to his release, the whole event served to steel Madero's resolve. He called for a revolution to be held on November 20th at precisely 6 p.m. in the name of land reform and political freedom. It didn't manifest, but a growing emergence of revolutionary pressure from various socioeconomic classes across the country eventually led to Diaz heading for exile in Paris. Diaz had been toppled. Madero was declared president, but this was just the beginning of the revolution. Madero's initial call had failed, but Diaz had left by spring 1911. This had been brought about by fierce fighting in rural areas in the north and south. Pascual Orozco and Pancho Villa raided government garrisons in the north after mobilizing their bands into more significant forces. Emiliano Zapata waged a violent class war against the caciques, or local bosses, in the south. After taking Ciudad Juarez on the Mexican-U.S. border, these revolutionary forces declared Madero president. However, all would not go smoothly from here. Madero believed in a return to political liberty, but did not endorse the kind of sweeping social and land reforms that other revolutionary forces now sought. Zapata and Villa were both champions of peasant and indigenous communities and wanted a radical redistribution of land from the wealthy landowners to the villagers themselves. A wealthy landowner himself, Madero would not go as far as this. Leading a broad cross-class coalition, Maduro's early reform attempts proved too radical for conservatives, but not extreme enough for revolutionaries. He was overthrown after 15 months during the 10 tragic days of February 1913 and was executed. He had been betrayed by a general named Huerta, who declared himself a military dictator backed by the United States. Going back to the Diaz days, the U.S. had plenty of commercial interest invested in the outcome of Mexico's political intrigues. A running theme through Mexico's progress as a nation, and many other Latin American countries, was the constant need to consider their relationship with the U.S. amid interventionism. In this case, U.S. investors, wary of revolutionary claims to redistribute land they were heavily invested in, sought to address the situation. The deal for Huerta to conspire with other factions to overthrow Madero is known as the Pact of the Embassy, because it was signed in the office of the U.S. ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson. If revolutionaries like Zapata and Villa were uninspired by Madero, they found a figure to unite against in Huerta. His despotic rule only lasted for a year as rebel forces converged on Mexico City in the summer of 1914. From here, the revolutionary cause split into infighting and disagreements over who should take power and the direction that the revolution should take. Conventionistas, including Zapata and Villa, persisted with ambitious aims to redistribute land. On the other side, constitutionalistas, led by Venustiano Carranza and Alvaro Obregón, believed in the primacy of liberal reforms with no real zeal for widespread changes in the country's social structure. Over the next few years, historians talk about the war to define what the revolution stood for. This was, in fact, a civil war that led to the death of at least 1 million Mexicans, showing this disagreement went far beyond a polite discourse. A significant event within this civil war was the bloody battle in April 1950 in Celaya, in which Obregón's forces routed Villa. Villa blamed his defeat on Woodrow Wilson's support of Carranza and Obregón's faction. Thereafter, Villa began a vendetta against Americans in the border region, executing some 17 U.S. citizens in January of 1916 at Santa Isabel, and even raiding New Mexico at Columbus. Villa's actions prompted Wilson to send General John J. Pershing with a small force into the Mexican hills to pursue Villa's bandits. It's this image of Villa that many find romantic. At this point, he is cornered, has experienced defeat, and his case seems lost. Yet he fights on, dedicated, a small group of desperados engaging in guerrilla warfare and unwilling to give in. He had shown cruelty to Americans through some of his tactics, but the fugitive's heroic image, dubbed the Centaur of the North, is one that endures. In the interfactional struggles, the Constitutionistas ultimately won out, and Carranza was elected president. In 1917, he brought in a new constitution that gave the government the right to confiscate land from wealthy landowners, guaranteed workers' rights, and limited the Roman Catholic Church's rights. However, it did confer dictatorial powers to the president. An extraordinary document that gave scope for widespread change was just a framework allowing for future developments and not immediately binding. Many of the innovative and groundbreaking policies laid out in the Constitution simply weren't enacted upon. Many of the promises in the 1917 Constitution weren't carried out until Lázaro Cárdenas came into office in 1934, 17 years after the initial revolutionary document and 24 years after Madero had called for his revolution in 1910. Cárdenas strengthened labor unions, nationalized Mexico's oil industry, and redistributed over 70,000 square miles of land. In the intervening years, Zapata had been assassinated in 1919. Carranza fell to the same fate soon after, and Villa was murdered in 1923. In every election throughout the 1920s, there was uprising and contention in the struggle to define the revolutionary legacy. So, how do we define the revolutionary legacy? It ended the dictatorship that went before. And to this day, the reworked Constitution does not allow elected officials to run for a second term. The Revolutionary Constitution itself enshrined many workers' rights and initiated many social and political reforms, though perhaps not achieving Villa and Zapata's lofty ambitions, and did reduce the power of the Catholic Church. Many historians point to the Mexican Revolution as having a significant influence on other revolutions to follow in other Latin American countries in the 20th century, and more widely revered transformations in Russia and China. Historians speculate that the Mexican revolutionaries had no real desire to export their ideals, perhaps explaining the lack of broader historical significance given to this transitional period in the country's past. Mexico's PRI, Institutional Revolutionary Party, has dominated Mexican politics to the present day, gaining political authority by evoking the national myths founded in the revolutionary period. The revolution's icons are still revered, with national monuments celebrating many figures, including Villa, Zapata, Madero, and Carranza, uniting these revolutionaries in national memory despite their contemporary disagreements. Therefore, in the search for the meaning of the revolution's events, as ever, it may be more important to see what it means to Mexicans today. To learn more about the Mexican Revolution, then check out our book, The Mexican Revolution, a captivating guide to the Mexican Civil War and how Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata impacted Mexico. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook for free while still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more
now that
videos like
clip
this.
has played, I'll talk about a little bit more of this story. So, today's post is an attempt to uncover the truth about this little-known incident, as it turns out. I found that the tale of Villa and his movie contract really informs the broader question of what in the heck is going on. And also, really, 1920s, not that long ago. Why so much confusion? So let me keep reading here. Finally, it deals with the odd way that fictions can become real if they are rooted in the truth and enough people believe them. I think they gave us Pancho Villa as like a Mexican version of Robin Hood, right? Somebody the poor, no matter how badly they were being beaten around, they could always say, Pancho Villa, he was our man, revolution, right? I used to spend quite a bit of time in Mexico. So it's a country I'm fairly familiar with. I even lived in Mexico for a short period around, I don't know, in the 70s sometime. Yes, I was quite an adventuresome little person, but okay, so a conflict which has opposing generals duked it out not only on the battlefield, but also in the newspaper and in cinema scenarios. At stake were the hearts and minds of the government and people of the United States, who could, if they wished, intervene decisively on one side or the other. Because of this, the revolution saw propaganda evolve from the crude publication of rival official claims into more subtle attempts to control the views of the journalists and cameramen who flooded into Mexico. Most of them were inexperienced, Magalat Americans, and almost all were as interested in making a name for themselves as they were in untangling the half-baked policies and the shifting allegations that distinguished the federales from the villistas from the zapistas. The result was a rich stew of truth, falsity, and reconstruction. There was plenty of bias. Excuse me, most of it is in the form of prejudice against Mexicans by calling them greasers. There were conflicts of interest as well. Several American media owners had extensive commercial interest in Mexico. William Randolph Hearst, who controlled vast tracts in northern Mexico, wasted no time impressing the U.S. intervention when Villa plundered his estates, appropriating 60,000 head of cattle. And there was eagerness to file ticket-selling, circulation-boosting sensations too. Villa himself was frequently portrayed as a monster of brutality and cruelty, particularly later in the war when he crossed the border and raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico. Much was exaggerated. The Literary Digest noted with a jaundiced eye. Battles innumerable have been fought. Scores of armies have been annihilated, wiped out, blown up, massacred, and wholly destroyed, according to the glowing reports of commanders on either side. But the supply of cannon fodder does not appear to have diminished appreciably. Never was there a war in which much gunpowder went off with less harm to the opposing forces. So they're saying that first war that so much gunpowder went off, but the opposing forces weren't really harmed. What is certain is that fierce competition for news produced a situation ripe for exploitation. All three of the principal leaders of the period, Villa, Zapata, and the federal generalissimo Victorian Huerta, sold access and eventually themselves to U.S. newsmen, trading inconvenience for the chance to position themselves as worthy recipients of foreign aid. Huerta got things off and running, compelling the cameramen who filmed his campaigns to screen their footage for him so he could censor it. But Villa was the one who maximized his opportunities. The upshot 4 years into the war was the rebel general's acceptance of the mutual film contract. The New York Times broke the news on January the 7th, 1940, and here's what it said. Pancho Villa, general in command of the Constitutional Army in northern Mexico, will in future carry on his warfare against President Huerta as a full partner in a moving picture venture with Harry E. Akins. The business of General Villa will be to provide moving picture thrillers in a way that is consistent with his plans to depose and drive Huerta out of Mexico. And the business of Mr. Aiken, the other partner, will be to distribute the resulting films throughout the peaceable sections of Mexico and to the United States and Canada. Nothing in this first report suggests that the contract was anything more than a broad agreement guaranteeing privileged access for Mutai's cameramen. A few weeks later, though, came word of the Battle of Ojinca, a northern town defended by a force of 5,000 federales, and for the first time there were hints that the contract included special clauses. Several newspapers reported that Villa had captured Ojinaga only after a short delay while Mutai's cameramen moved into position. The rebel was certainly willing to accommodate Mutai in unusual ways. The New York Times reported that at the film company's request, he had placed his casual battle dress with a custom-made comic opera general's uniform to make him look more imposing. The uniform remained the property of Mutai, and Villa was forbidden to wear it in any front of any other cameras. So they even came up with a special uniform that Villa could only wear in front of this one camera. There was also decent evidence that elements of the División del Norte were pressed into service to stage a reenactment for the cameras. Raoul Walsh recalled Villa gamely doing take after take of a scene of him coming towards the camera. We'd set it up at the head of the street, and he'd hit that horse with a whip and his spurs and go about 90 miles an hour. I don't know how many times we said, despacio, despacio, slow, senor, please, slow down. But the contract between the rebel leader and Mutual Films provides to have been a good deal less proscriptive than popularly supposed. The only surviving copy unearthed in a Mexico City archive by Villa's biographer Frederick Katz lacks all the eye-opening clauses that have made it famous. There was absolutely no mention of reenactment of battle scenes or of Villa providing good lighting, Katz explained. What the contract did specify was that the Mutual Film Company was granted exclusive rights to film Villa's troops in battle, and that Villa would receive 20% of all revenues that the film produced. A contemporary newspaper speculates on the likely consequences of the appearance of newsreel cameras at the front. So, the notion of a contract that called for war to be fought Hollywood style, in short, is myth, though. But it did not stop the New York Times from hazarding on January the 8th, 1914, that if Villa wants to be a good business partner, he will have to make a great effort so that the cameramen can carry out their work successively. He will have to make sure that the interesting attacks take place when the light is good and the killings are in good focus. This might interfere with military operations that, in theory, have other objectives. No such compromises seem to have occurred in practice, and the mutual contract seems to have outlived its usefulness for both parties within weeks. But what followed suggests other ways in which the facts on the ground were subsumed by the demands of the cinema. As early as the end of February, Mutual switched its attention from shooting documentary footage to creating a fictional movie about Villa that would incorporate stock shots obtained by the newsreel men. The production of this movie, called The Life of General Villa, probably explains how those rumors that Mutual's newsreel footage had to be reshot in the studio lot got started. It premiered in November in New York on May the 1914 and turned out to be a typical melodrama of the period. Villa was given an acceptable background for a hero. In real life, he and his family had been sharecroppers, but in the life, they were middle-class farmers, and the drama revolved around the quest for revenge on a pair of federales who had raped his sister, which bore at least some semblance to real events in Villa's life. The point was that it also came closer to conforming to what its target audience demanded from a movie: close-ups, action, and a story. Contemporary sources make it easy to understand why Mutual had this sudden change of heart. Villa had kept his side of the bargain. The company's cameramen had secured the promised exclusive footage of the Battle of Oinga. But when the results of these initial efforts reached New York on January 22, they proved disappointing. The footage was no more dramatic then than filmed earlier in the war without the benefit of any contract. Motion Picture World reported this on January the 24th. They said, "The pictures do not portray a battle. They show, among other things, the conditions in and around Oinga after the battle, which was fought in and about the town. There was a good view of the police station of Oinga and the little plaza of the stricken town. Other things shown on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande were the train of captured guns and ammunition wagons, the review of the army before General Villa, the captured Federale prisoners, the wretched refugees on their way to the American side." American filmmaker, this person, Barud, let me skip past that. The Morale contract, in short, had merely served to highlight the limitations of early filmmakers. Previously, newsreel cameramen had fallen, explained their inability to secure sensational action footage by citing specific local difficulties. not least the problem of gaining access to the battlefield. Adewinga, granted the best possible conditions to shoot and the active support of one of the commanders, they had failed again, and the reason is obvious. For all of Nuttall's boasts, contemporary movie cameras were heavy, clumsy things that could be operated only by setting them up on a tripod and hand cranking the film. Using them anywhere near a real battle would be suicidal. A publicity still purporting to show rival filmmaker Ellen Baruch filming in action, protected by two Indian bodyguards armed with rifles and stripped to their loincloths, was as fraudulent as much of the moving footage brought out of Mexico. The only action that could safely be obtained consisted of long shots of artillery, bombardments, and the mass maneuverings of men on distant horizons. Newsmen and their bosses in the United States responded to this problem in various ways. Pressure to deliver hot footage remained as high as ever, which meant there were really only two possible solutions. One person representing Hearst with an American punitive expedition sent to punish Villa's border raids 2 years early, returned home to find that publications had concocted a thrilling tale describing how he had found himself in the middle of the battle and bravely. One of my tripod bearers smiled at my shouting, and as he smiled, he clutched his hand to his abdomen and fell forward kicking. "Action!" I cried. "This is what I've wanted. Give 'em hell, boys. Wipe out that blankety-blank dash greasers." Then, somewhat out of the tangle of guns, a bullet cuts its way. "Zing!" I heard it whistle. The splinters cut my face as it hit the camera. It ripped the side open and smashed the little wooden magazine. I sprang crazily to stop it with my hands, but out of the box coiled the precious film. Stretching and glistening in the sun, it fell and died. This dog ate my homework excuse could only be used once, however, so for the most part, newsmen supplied an altogether neater solution of their own. For most, a trip to Mexico meant contenting themselves with creating their own dramatic footage to meet the insatiable demand of audiences at home. Which is to say, they carefully reconstructed action scenes that they or someone else had witnessed if they were moderately scrupulous, or simply made scenarios up from scratch if they were not. While the practice of taking footage was widespread throughout the Mexican War, and many of the pioneer filmmakers were remarkably open about it in their memoirs, little mention was made of it at the time. Indeed, those who flocked to the cinema to see newsreels of the Mexican War, which the evidence suggests were among the most popular films of the period, they were encouraged to believe they were seeing the real thing. The film companies competed vigorously to advertise their latest reels in unprecedentedly realistic ways. To take only one example, Frank Jones' early called War with Huerta was billed in moving picture world as positively the greatest Mexican war picture ever made. Do you realize that this is not a posed picture, but taken on the field of action, it went on to say. The reality of the situation was exposed a few months later by Jones' rival, Fitz Wagner, who traveled to Mexico for Pathé and later enjoyed a distinguished career in Europe. "I have seen 4 big battles. On each occasion, I was threatened with arrest from the Federal General if I took any pictures. He also threatened on one occasion when he saw me turning the crank to smash the camera. He would have done so too, but for the fact the rebels came pretty close just then, and he had to take it on the run to save his hide." A tiny handful of cameramen were luckier and, given precisely the right circumstances, could obtain useful action footage. Street fighting is the easiest to film, for if you can get into a good location on a side street, you have the protection of all the intervening buildings from artillery and rifle fire, while you occasionally, give a second here, while you occasionally get the chance to shoot a few feet of swell film. I got some great stuff in Mexico a few days later before Madero was killed. One fellow, not 20 feet from my camera, had his head shot off. Even then, however, the resultant footage, although suitably dramatic, never made it to the screen. The darn censors would not let us show the pictures in the United States, the newsman said. What do you suppose they sent us to war for? The best solution, as more than one film unit discovered, was to wait for the fighting to die down and then enlist any nearby soldiers to produce a lively but sanitized reconstruction. There were sometimes hidden dangers in this, too. One cameraman who persuaded a group of soldiers to fight some invading Americans only narrowly escaped with his own life when the Mexicans realized they were being portrayed as cowards, being soundly thrashed by the upstanding Yankees. Feeling that the honor of their nation was being besmirched, the historian Margarita says they decided to change the story and defend themselves, firing off a volley of bullets. A real fight then ensued. Got to be careful when you go out and stage fights now, don't you? So, this is the final of this. So let me just scroll down here real quick. Thankfully, there were safer ways to complete an assignment. Victor Milner, a cameraman attached to the U.S. Marine Corps, sent to occupy the Mexican port out of Veracruz early in the war for reasons too complicated to recount in detail here, made it offshore to discover that the troops had already secured their objectives. Soon afterward, however, he had the luck to run into a friend who, in civilian life, had been in the public relations business and was anxious to get some good publicity for the Navy and Marines. Boy, isn't that handy? He got together with the local commanders and they staged the greatest replay of the storming of the post office that you can imagine. I am sure it was far better than the real thing. The pictures were a newsreel sensation and were shown as a scoop in all the theaters before any of us got back to the States. To this day, I don't think anyone in the entire United States was aware that they were seeing a replay and that the shots were staged. Kind of like everything going on now, right? So I'm going to cover just a couple of these fun lies. This one is slavery was just in the South. Though school taught us something different, Southerners didn't get a patent on racism, and people in the North have had a bad history of slavery. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington told Northern and Southern colonists that we must fight the British so we don't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary way. In New York City, the situation was especially shameful. A fifth of the city's population was slaves in 1740, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country. 42% of residents owned slaves, according to the New York Public Library, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. Slave labor built much of the city, and although they didn't have to work on plantations, you are still considered property to be bought, sold, and used. Isn't much consolidation. Also, don't forget, they used slaves to build pretty much all Harvard, all of the U.S. universities were built by using slave labor. Even during the Civil War, New York came close to joining the secession after South Carolina. Though the city wanted to side with the South, mostly for economic reasons, they still weren't worried about the idea of siding with slaveholders. The New York Herald wrote this: "If Lincoln is elected, you will have to compete with the labor of 4 million emancipated Negroes. So if a Yankee guy gets a little high and mighty around his Southern friends, just remind him of that quote and watch his liberal guilt consume him." Another good one: Gandhi was nearly a saint. That was a myth. Picking on Ghandi seems like a pretty low blow or a decent name for an emo band. So awful either way. The idea that the mind behind the non-violent fight for India's independence could be anything less than pure seems almost heretical. In fact, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Joseph Liebing's realistic biography of Gandhi has been banned in Gandhi's home state of Gujarat for blasphemy. Most of us don't know that Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male bodybuilder before he got involved in British-Indian relations. Now, if Gandhi was gay, who cares? But Gandhi tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing, as per the Huffington Post. And to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he'd sleep in bed naked with his teenage grandnieces. But worse than his sexual hypocrisy was his terrible racism. Gandhi may have wanted India freed from British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the rigid caste system of the nation. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were led to a lower caste jail for protesting. He said, "We could understand not being classed with whites. Just to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. The convicts even more so. They're troublesome, they're dirty, and live like animals." So this was when asked about Indian views on race versus South Africans. Gandhi wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do." Though Gandhi did bring some good to the world and was tragically assassinated, we also need to know he was only human. Yeah, right. And also maybe a gay guy, right? Myth: the U.S. declared independence on the 4th of July. Fireworks, flag cakes, barbecues, your 4th of July activities to celebrate American independence from Mother England are a lie. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on July the 1st, 1776, and the next day, July the 2nd, representatives from the 13 colonies overwhelmingly approved a motion to declare independence. The assembly spent 2 days revising a statement primarily written by Virginia delegate Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, and ratifying it on July the 4th, ingraining the 4th of July into the brains of freedom-loving Americans forever. Fine, it was ratified on July 4th. Big deal, you're saying. Hey, wait a minute. The members of the Second Continental Congress still had to actually sign the Declaration of Independence, and they didn't start leaving their Herbie Hancocks until August the 2nd, 1776. because news traveled a lot slower in 1776. It took a while for King George III of England to hear about the declaration. He made his first public remarks on the matter in October of 1776. There was a myth that Salem witches were burned at the stake. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 93 remain one of the darkest chapters of American history. In the Massachusetts colony, more than 200 people were accused and tried for the difficult to prove crime of being witches. 20 of the accused were forced guilty and killed straight away. However, none lost their lives by being burned at the stake like most people think. At least none of the American witches did. In European witch trials, they were all the rage. Guilty witches were executed with fire. In Salem, though, 19 of the 20 witches were hanged on Gallows Hill. The other witches, called Gillis Corey, was crushed to death with heavy rocks. Well, they're always killing them somehow, aren't they? Myth. Paul Revere yelled, "The British are coming." If your dusty old history books are to be believed, the build-up to the American Revolution War was pretty dramatic. A dude named Paul Revere rode through a bunch of towns on horseback screaming, "The British are coming!" And everyone freaked out and got their guns, and the war started. But wait a minute here. I think I didn't copy the rest of that story. Sorry about that. I'll try to get back to that. And here's the one that I think is weird. I'm not sure if the world is flat or round. And you're thinking, oh, wait a minute. What are you talking about? Well, a lot of people who study the Bible, there's a lot of things in the Bible that talk about the earth being flat. Is the earth flat? I don't know. I have been working to expose the patterns these people exhibit. And if the earth is flat, will be one thing that I do not plan to expose. And you're thinking, well, why not? Well, how could I really logistically, at my age, at all the years I've been uncovering all this work, how could I right now sit down and start trying to figure out, is the earth flat? Well, I'm not going to. I believe it's probably a lie, but I also believe it's also partially a trick. So there was a myth that said Columbus needed to prove the world was round. While few still think Christopher Columbus discovered America, many believe the explorer's voyage was important because it proved the world was round. According to historian Jeffrey Russell, the idea that Columbus had to prove a planet full of flat earthers wrong didn't take hold until the 1830s or so. This French writer was so anti-religion that in books they said he argued that the Catholic Church leaders of the past foolishly believed the world was flat. So he said that in 1822, he primarily wrote fiction, and he used his storytelling skills to embellish his Columbus biography. In other words, he made stuff up, such as a passage in which Columbus tries to convince a council of 1940s religious clerics that he won't sail off the edge of the earth. People knew the earth was round at least as far back as ancient Greece. Science historians wrote that the concept of a round earth was central to Aristotle's 4th century BC writings on cosmology, as well as the calculations of the earth's circumference in the 3rd century BC. Few people in Columbus's time were dumb enough to think the earth was flat. But people in our time are dumb enough or snobby enough to think everyone else is dumb. Yeah, I find this Earth stuff being flat, mainly religious people. I had a couple of religious people write me almost like documentaries stating all of the Bible references to why exactly the Earth was flat. And I gotta tell you, when I was reading all those Bible verses, because I do take seriously when people send me information, I really had myself convinced for a while. I thought, hey, maybe they're right. And then I thought, come on, just slow down for a minute here, okay? Just slow down. So, yeah, is it flat? I don't know. Everything has been a lie. NASA is a big lie. They never went to the moon. They haven't done all these things. So, could it be a lie? I would have to say possibly, right? Why would I say no? They've lied about every single thing else, even Pancho Villa. So why wouldn't they be lying about the earth? Doesn't make any sense, right? And yes, I've looked at what the Christian people also say online about it, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but they seem to be very, very convinced that the earth is flat because of the Bible. So, there was another myth. America was enthusiastic to join World War II. Even the people who marched with no blood for oil signs and are currently protesting drone strikes tend to still have a little fondness for World War II. Who doesn't want to defeat a bunch of Nazis and get the chance to make fun of Germans? World War II was just too good to resist. But Americans at the time weren't so enthusiastic. President Franklin Roosevelt was the most vocal supporter of the war, while oddly enough, aviator Charles Lindbergh was one of the biggest opponents. Lindbergh's strong isolationist got him labeled as a Nazi sympathizer. It's not exactly true, since he mostly admired Germany for their technology and economic revitalization. But he also thought that white people were superior to everyone else. So honestly, he was about as close to a Nazi sympathizer as you could be without donning a swastika. Lindbergh said he didn't approve of Hitler's treatment of Jews, but he seemed cool with everything else. Other Americans wanted to stay out and were not motivated by racism. Europe seemed like another world, and we had no place in their fight. Plus, the war meant the draft was coming back, and most people weren't interested in having a repeat of the Civil War or World War I. College students were one of the largest contingents against the war. They figured they'd be the first to die if we headed overseas, so students at Yale formed a large isolationist group called America First. Members of the group included Gerald Ford, Supreme Court Justice Potter, I Know It When I See It, Stewart, Gore Vidal, and John F. Kennedy. It seems like young people always fought every war. If we could go back to the college campuses during the American Revolution, we'd probably see a lot of people with no blood for T signs. So, yeah, people, they say in history that we were like, hey, let's go, come on, let's go kill those people. Yeah, we got it. That is why they had to stage the deal with Japan, because people did not want to go to war. So, of course, they dragged us into it, right? So there's a myth also. Edison was a great inventor. In school, we learned that Thomas Edison was a great inventor who gave America the gift of light in light bulb form. You can't deny that Edison was a bright mind who developed several things that made it easier for everybody. But you should also learn that Edison was a monopolizing, thieving jerk. Finally, he didn't really invent the light bulb. He built upon several other inventions, and some say he stole several innovations that led him to creating and taking credit for the bulbs we know today. Edison had a team of workers at his Palo Alto, at his Menlo Park, New Jersey facility And in 1892, they invented the kinetoscope. It was the beginning of motion pictures, and while it may not sound entertaining now, the idea of moving pictures was pretty ingenious. Edison's assistants tried to get him to invest more time into inventing projection devices for his new technology. But Edison thought there was no money in moving pictures. After kinetoscopes became incredibly popular, Edison did a 180 and started working on a projecting device. Or rather, Edison asked other people who made innovations on projection technology to file the patent in his name, while he gave them a decent one-time fee. People thought that was a morally questionable move, and Edison replied, "Well, everyone steals in industry and commerce. I've stolen a lot myself. The thing is to know how to steal." This is just so insane. So when he got caught stealing and he was told it was morally questionable, Edison said, "Everyone steals in industry and commerce. I've stolen a lot myself. The thing is to know how to steal." Later, Edison tried to monopolize the film industry and force filmmakers to move to California to avoid his many lawsuits, giving birth to Hollywood. And that is all very true because the people in Hollywood, they moved to Hollywood because they were afraid of lawsuits from Edison. Lastly, Edison killed an elephant to prove that his crappy electricity was the best. Edison was a proponent of direct current DC electricity when Nikola Tesla touted alternating current AC as the best option. AC enabled long-distance power transmissions and is now used exclusively in every home, though some technology like computers use both. But Edison didn't have the patents for AC, so he went on a major campaign to prove the dangers of alternating current. His biggest stunt was electrocuting Topsy the elephant to prove the AC currents were so dangerous. So he did it to show that it was so dangerous that it could kill the giant creature, this big, huge elephant. Then, to be even more of a jerk, Edison filmed the event and released it, calling "electrocuting an elephant" to theaters. So yeah, and they showed it in theaters. I guess people just sat there, "Oh, okay, okay." I am going to be closing this off right now. I have some files over there for you to take a look at should you choose. And uncovering the truth and myth behind Pancho Villa, the untold story of Pancho Villa. Who was Pancho Villa? Pancho Villa Wikipedia. And I think that Pancho Villa was a trick, right? But of course, that's only my opinion. You're welcome to have your own opinions. My point for today is to show how it has all been manipulated. So do you really believe that after they got onto how to manipulate filmmaking during Pancho Villa, do you really think they straightened up and started really doing things correctly? Why would they? When cheating and lying is in their veins. Like the one guy said, they all steal. That is how they got ahead, by stealing from the rest of us and getting us to give them our labor. And that made them all fabulous wealthy. So now they can turn around and treat all of us like dirt because they have what they came for. They wanted the money to control the rest of us. And of course, electricity was one of their biggest tricks. Electricity was invented to harm the rest of us. Our bodies are electricity. Go look on my tab called Smart Meters. Our bodies are magnificent machines run by electricity. The sole purpose of Edison and all this electricity stuff was to destroy and cripple our DNA right now, like they're doing exactly now. And I'll tell you, if you try to explain to somebody how electricity was a trick, no one will hear you. They say, but we need electricity. What are you talking about? Well, it was a trick. It was a huge trick. And that is why we are here right now, because they are now annihilating most of us in our own homes using smart meters hooked up to transformers to transmit electricity into our homes at the volumes which will make all of the children likely very anxious. It will make people very sick. And the trick is so good that no one will know they're getting sick from all of that dirty electricity. And it has been all staged, planned, maneuvered, and scripted. I tried to look for how much money they made off of Pancho Villa, and I kind of lost interest. I imagine between the movies, the books, the lives, each one of these events are big money makers, right? And then you give them over to the people on social media, and then they make more money by retelling the stories, right? And they drag the stories out and repeat the lies themselves to keep it all going. Stop believing the lies. Learn to look for yourself. It's actually quite fun. I have enjoyable days, as tragic as it all is, because it would be horrible to be sitting here and being this sick and not have a way to keep my mind active. So I stay very engaged with all this. It's a big, fascinating world out there if you just look at all the lies with an open mind. And so that means that whenever they present us with something new, our first thought out of our mind should be, is this a lie? They're coming for all of us hard. For the first time in 30 years in this country, they're cutting back on people's access to food via food stamps. They are cooking the books. Nobody knows how many unemployed people are out there. The only employment numbers going up are because people are taking multiple jobs. All of the car dealerships are flooded with cars they cannot sell. They can't even get back all the cars they can't sell. The local banks are the ones who took out all these huge loans for all these commercial companies, commercial buildings. Do you realize, I never knew this before, that if you own a commercial building, you have to re-up it every so many years with a bank. A lot of those buildings are coming due to be renewed. These buildings were valued at, let's say, 20 million. They're getting less than $1 million. Everything is changing, but people are still being very engaged and not noticing. But I think a lot of people might be noticing because Americans know how to hide their feelings. This country is built on people who seem to be okay looking the other way, right? Rah, 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 America, red, white, and blue. To the point that, to their own detriment, people are now planning the next election. They honestly think Trump is going to save this boat. No one wants to look at the fact that it was Trump that got all the vaccines going, right? Trump was the one who gave all the wealthy people the last huge tax cut. That was Trump. It is a scam. It is us against them. And unless we prove to be a sturdier group than we are appearing to prove right now, they likely will roll all of us over if we allow that to happen. We have a lot of important things coming up. Everything is being polluted. I think they're coming clean with all this pollution because the next trick, they're going to tie this on us. They're going to say, oh, because of all this pollution, now we need these other new laws. You see how this will start to happen? They're already talking about another lockdown. They're already talking about this new health plan. There are not that many of them, but they have recruited an entire band of them. Please read my book. I've offered you it for free. I am so concerned about this next lockdown. I'm concerned about you being locked down with somebody who may not be good for you. And you're thinking, well, this person is all I have. You would be better off on your own than being in lockdown with a psychopath under your same roof, because there will be another lockdown coming. Will it happen? I do not know. I will not predict a thing. It depends on if people stand up or not. But they are heading our way, polluting everything that we've ever known. They're robbing everything. They came up with this deal about real estate that is so criminal that I cannot even believe it. They are taking people who have existing, anybody who has any kind of equity in their home, right? They're after those people right now. They have cooked up this madness to extract that wealth that people have in their homes. They're out to get it all. Every dime of it, these people want scooped up and into their pockets. We have a lot coming up. I think the best route is to show some solidarity with each other. Maybe stop looking at each other as crazy. There are a lot of us out there that have been trying to tell the story of what's going on. And frankly, a lot of us are now starting to go away and end up bye-bye, right? So they have a way of destroying things. That is the plan, not the bug in the system. So I'm going to be closing this off. When you start thinking, and I do this myself all the time because I generally like people, I like good news and stuff, right? So I find myself all the time saying, well, wait a minute, that person wasn't exactly what I thought. Just watch for the patterns. This isn't a big mystery. It's as simple as can be. They're coming for us. Are we just going to sit in our chairs and let it happen? I don't know. I don't know. I'll be back when I have more to say. So be safe out there. And remember, it's just a game board. What's your role in the game board? Uncover that. If you keep your mind generated and busy, you might find that there's some other things that you may want to pay attention to while the game board is still rolling along, right? Lots of opportunity for change, lots of opportunity for growth. But we don't get growth, we don't get opportunity if we have our heads buried in the sand.